Okay, so I got a weird one today. Last year, while everybody seemed to be waiting for new full-frame cameras, Blackmagic took a Pocket Cinema Camera 4K sensor and put it in the hilariously tiny Micro Studio camera chassis and priced it at $995 USD. If you live further away from the broadcast world and closer to the content creation side, this could seem like a pretty confusing release, but I think this camera body is really interesting and worth talking about. In its intended use cases, it's really hard to beat, but I want to know if the Micro Studio 4K G2 is useful for filmmakers too, or if it only belongs in the broadcast world. Now, I know some people complain the new Pocket Cinema cameras aren't exactly pocketable, especially if you're going to be adding an external monitor. The Micro Studio is much smaller and can certainly fit into a pocket, but you probably wouldn't want to. Because there isn't an onboard monitor, the camera is basically impossible to use without an external display. You wouldn't really gain any advantage with the Micro Studio over the Pocket 4K for handheld work, and it's not really designed for that either. However, things could get pretty interesting if you're buying with the intention of designing a rig. Because the Studio is smaller and more cube-like, it could balance better in a full rig versus the much wider Pocket Cinema body style. If you add a cage,
which I don't have,
a nice side handle,
which I do not have,
a base plate, rail, SSD, and external battery combination,
I actually do have that,
you could end up with something pretty interesting if you find yourself in a pinch. While it's possible, ultimately using the Micro Studio as a rigged-up handheld camera is far from what Blackmagic had in mind while designing this thing. If you're looking for a well-rounded camera to run around with that has a great image, the Pocket 4K is a much better option with its feature set. But there are specific use cases when the Micro Studio is the way to go. On set, you could have a whole bunch of them because they cost relatively nothing compared to a modern cinema camera package. Because it's Micro Four Thirds, the lenses can be super tiny and cheap. Between the included LPE6 battery and a lens, you're barely increasing the footprint. Then you pick an interesting angle, set it up, check it with a field monitor, plug in an SSD, and move on. If you're shooting a car chase, you could put a couple of these on each car and barely offset your budget, rigging, and space on set. You can run mains power and data and then forget about it, but because they added a battery plate on the back, you can also use this as an action cam of sorts. The Micro Studio can be both a permanent broadcast camera or a cinema quality GoPro that shoots RAW. Now, the biggest hurdles that we do have to deal with is the lack of an onboard display and the inability to internally record. Unlike the old Micro Cinema camera that shares the same body design, the Micro Studio doesn't have an SD card slot or any internal memory options, really. The trade-off is the benefit of a truly ridiculous selection of I/O. There's a beautiful full-size HDMI port, 12G SDI in and out, 3.5mm mic in, a locking DC power, and USB-C. In a broadcast scenario, you can plug in power and SDI and call it a day. But if you're going to use this thing as a cinema camera, we'll need to get a little bit creative. There's already an LPE6 battery plate on the back, which is perfect. We'll just pack a couple of those in my bag. Next, we need to worry about an external monitor. I actually think a viewfinder instead of a monitor would be especially cool for this setup, but sadly, I don't have one. We'll just have to settle for my Ninja 5. After a NATO rail, a Tilta monitor mount, and an angled HDMI cable, we can see what we're doing. Navigating through the menus of the Studio is a little bit odd. First thing you need is a monitor, and then there are 5 buttons on the back. You got menu, up, down, set, and then a power button. If you want to change settings like ISO, shutter angle, or white balance, you just hit set, and then you can cycle through these. Set's kind of like a confirmation, menu is kind of like a back button, and if you want to go through any of the settings in the menu, you just hit menu, and then you can go through everything that you would normally have in a Blackmagic camera. Definitely not as easy to use as a dedicated touchscreen. You're not going to want to jump in there and change settings all the time, but that's a sacrifice to be made for the small form factor. The HDMI puts out a maximum resolution of 1080p, so if we want to use my Ninja 5 to record externally via HDMI, we're only going to get 1080p ProRes. Which is more than okay with me, but come on, where's the theater in that? Since this camera has Blackmagic RAW built in, I would love to use it. And luckily, the USB-C port records straight to SSDs. I installed an old SanDisk, and with a little bit of Velcro, we are good to go. I'm sure there's much more specific and better hardware for this, but what we've built here will work. Micro Four Thirds is such a great lens mount for this camera too because there's so many fun lenses to check out. There's a gigantic catalog of Micro Four Thirds lenses made by Panasonic, OM System, tons of third-party manufacturers, and hundreds of vintage lenses that are ready to be adapted. I mostly use the Micro Studio with C-mount lenses since I happen to have several in the studio right now, which are really interesting and budget-friendly. The Micro Studio uses the same sensor as the Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, which means it's 4K, Micro Four Thirds, and has a dual native ISO at 400 and 3200. That also means the image quality is fantastic. I'm going to take my standard node tree and just plop it right on. If we go into our RAW controls, you can see that we did record in Blackmagic RAW 8:1, I believe. So all I need to do is come into my log transform and make sure that we're doing wide gamut 4:5, and then we come out of film Gen 5. Normally in this node tree, I'm going to my color correction and contrast nodes to adjust the exposure or anything else like that. But since we did record in RAW, I can just directly come down here and mess with it. It reacts very naturally. We're gonna land, I don't know, maybe right there. If we wanted to, we could warm it up, cool it down. I really just want to point out the separation that the sensor is able to do here with this green. This plant looks so natural, so healthy. The green is coming through not as a yellow or even as a weird plummy magenta, but as a true green. And then right next to it, this furniture piece is wooden. And it looks so healthy and warm and not like a gray, not a yellow. With lesser sensors, maybe older sensors, the difference between this green and this sort of beige would be a little closer, but there's so much color separation here and it just looks awesome. Can do all kinds of crazy grading. And the image just stays together. It's very hard to break it. Got a film emulation on here. Just looks so good. I'm going to load this grade with option 1, and now it's in my number 1 slot. Go to the next shot, command 1, paste it, and look, now we're a little bit overexposed. No problem. Just go down. We're not losing any detail at all. Zoom all the way on Aspen's nose to look at some texture. There's a tiny bit of noise. Looks like we're at ISO 1000. We did bump the exposure down. Highlights look good. We're not losing any detail here. The yellow gold of Aspen's coat is coming through. Again, not falling away into a gray or a darker greeny kind of yellow. We don't want that. Another shot from the same scene. Take the exposure down. Oh, it just looks so good. Okay, so we've copied and pasted this grade onto another shot, but this is an exterior, and now we're looking at Lake Michigan here. So this is going to need a completely different approach. Going to turn the exposure down. We are very cool in the color temperature, so let's spike that up to, 5500 maybe. And then I'm going to do a little bit of contrast work on these splines. It's very sharp. Actually, this could be slow motion. It is slow motion. Okay. It's looking kind of bitey, a little sharp. This is probably shot in f11, which I wouldn't normally do, but I didn't have an ND filter here, so you can see the bite, the sharpness here. It also shows off how potentially sharp the sensor is. It's pretty impressive, the amount of detail you'll be able to get out of it. And this is a lens from the 30s too, so really cool the amount of detail that we're pulling out. I'm going to load that in slot 2. Okay, so we got some low light here. Go 4200. I'm going to hit Shift D to turn off all of the adjustments that I've done. You can also hit this button up here to turn that off. Let's go down here and check out our noise. Very granular, very filmic, super duper easy to denoise. Nothing weird, no fixed noise pattern. Put the grade back on. It's all kind of lost in there. I might do a little bit of ramping. Let's push down a little bit more. Looks really great. Because, like I said, this is the 4K sensor. You have the dual native ISO at 400 and 3200. You're not necessarily going to be able to see in the dark like an A7S III sensor, an FX3 sensor, but I've never been in a situation where I needed more sensitivity than what the sensor can give me at 3200. Here's another shot. Looks great. Here's another shot. Got a nice little bit of texture here from the noise. I would probably not denoise this. I think it looks awesome. Here's a slightly different scene, and we have detail in the shadows. It's pretty noisy, but that should be pushed down anyway. So here's a shot of my mom's depression glass, and I wanted to show this because they have a very particular green color, and if I just white balance correctly, the detail we pulled out of it looks awesome. The green hue is incredible. The nuance in the highlights, this lime that goes into these darker parts where the glass is a little bit thicker, where they're stacked together. The point is, there's almost nothing that this camera won't be able to handle, which is a really great feeling to have on set, that you don't have a camera that lacks the sensitivity to shoot in less than ideal lighting situations, that you'll have to do a lot of work in post to fix color science. There's really nothing to worry about, and that's what we've come to expect from Blackmagic sensors these days. I think the Micro Studio Camera 4K G2 is a camera body that is only useful when you approach it with the right mindset. By itself, right out of the box, there's not a lot to see, but with a little bit of rigging and creativity, this thing is really special. The image quality is ridiculously good, especially for the small form factor. You get great I/O, the physical footprint's tiny, and of course the price point is also great. This thing is already well known and loved in the broadcast world, but I think there's some very real and very fun ways to use it in the filmmaking world. If you want to pick one up, links are in the description, but otherwise, thanks for watching. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you soon.